Lester Aldridge spent 81 years making his farm better than he found it. When he died, he left it to all three of his children, but with one condition: they had to work it together for a full year. No hired management, no shortcuts. 4 days a week, every week in the dirt. At the end of that year, his oldest neighbor, a man who'd farmed the adjacent land for 40 years, would decide which one of them understood the farm well enough to keep it. Franklin had an MBA. Patricia ran a logistics empire out of Atlanta. Rowan had a high school diploma and 9 years of mud on his boots. You already know who everyone expected to win. Then June came. 11 inches of rain in 9 days. The drainage system failed. The corn was underwater, and the man with the MBA was standing knee-deep in a ditch at 6 in the morning, following his little brother's instructions. That was the moment everything changed, not because Rowan was right, but because Franklin finally stopped assuming he was wrong. Lester Aldridge died the way he had lived, without making it easy for anyone. He had spent 81 years on the same 320 acres in Limestone County, Alabama, making decisions that confounded his neighbors, outlasted his critics, and quietly proved themselves right over timelines that most people weren't patient enough to wait for. He had farmed through the collapse of cotton, through the fertilizer price shocks of the 70s, through the farm crisis of the 80s that took land from families who had held it for generations, through the consolidation years when every agricultural economist in the state was explaining why operations his size were economically inviable. He had farmed through all of it, and the land was better when he died than when he had inherited it, which was more than most people could say about most things they had been given. He died on a Wednesday in November. His oldest, Franklin, drove up from Huntsville in a truck that was newer than it needed to be for the hour drive. He arrived first. That was consistent with Franklin's general relationship to arriving first. His middle child, Patricia, flew in from Atlanta, where she ran the Southeast Regional operations for a logistics company, and she arrived second with a carry-on bag and the focused calm of a woman who has managed difficult situations for 2 decades and brings that management style home, whether she means to or not. His youngest, Rowan, drove up from the farm itself where he had been living and working for 9 years. He drove the same truck he'd had for 6 of those years. He arrived last, because he had spent the morning doing what needed doing before he left. The morning's work, regardless of what else the day held. The attorney's name was Gerald Marsh. He had been Lester's attorney for 22 years. He read the will in his office on Sir Jefferson Street, Athens, on a Thursday morning, with the smell of old carpet and the sound of traffic outside, and what he read was precise in its language and unusual enough in its structure that it took some time for the full weight of it to land. The farm would not be sold. The farm would not be divided. All 3 children would hold equal, undivided interest in the property for 1 calendar year from the date of death. During that year, all 3 were required to participate actively in the farm's operation, residing on or within reasonable distance of the property, contributing meaningful physical labor to its management. No fewer than 4 days per week. No professional farm management service could be contracted. No corporate lease arrangement. The farm had to be worked by Lester's children, or it would not be worked. At the end of the year, the farm would be conveyed in its entirety, not divided, in its entirety, to whichever of the 3 children Lester's neighbor and oldest friend, a man named Darnell Whitfield, who farmed the adjacent land, determined had shown the deepest understanding of what the farm required and what it meant. Darnell had already been told. He had agreed. Franklin said, before Gerald finished the sentence about Darnell, "That's not a legally enforceable standard." Gerald set down the document. He looked at Franklin with the patience of a man who has practiced law in a small Alabama city for 30 years. "Your father anticipated that response," he said. He produced a supplementary document, 9 pages. Lester had defined his terms with a care that suggested he had thought about this conversation specifically. Understanding of what the farm required meant demonstrated knowledge of the soil's condition and history. The water management systems Lester had developed over 40 years, the crop rotation logic, the equipment and its maintenance, the relationships with suppliers and markets that the operation depended on. And at the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that was shakier than it had been but still recognizable, Lester had written this: "The person who understands that the land does not belong to you, and that you belong to it, is the person who should have it." Gerald looked up from the document. Franklin was writing on a notepad he had brought. Patricia was looking at her hands. Rowan was looking at the window, at the November street outside. At something beyond it, they drove to the farm in a sequence that felt nothing like a family arriving together. Franklin first, Patricia second, Rowan last. The farm road was 2 miles of packed gravel off the county road, lined with cedar and pecan trees that Lester had planted in the early 80s. He had planted them because he wanted windbreaks, and because he liked pecans, and because he had thought about what the road would look like in 40 years when the trees were mature. The trees were mature now. The road looked exactly like what he had imagined. Rowan thought about this every time he drove it. Neither Franklin nor Patricia had thought about it in years. The farmhouse was white frame, a story and a half, with a deep front porch and the settled quality of a structure that has been continuously lived in and continuously maintained. Not restored or renovated, just kept, which produces a different quality than either neglect or improvement. The barn to its east was older than the house and in better condition than it had any right to be, which was entirely due to Lester's conviction that a barn that works is worth maintaining, and a barn that doesn't is not worth having, and you have to decide which kind yours is and act accordingly. Rowan made coffee. They sat in the living room, where Lester's reading glasses were still on the side table, and his seed catalogs were still stacked on the bookshelf in the order he had arranged them. Some other system that had made sense to him, and Rowan had never asked about it and now could not ask, and this was the kind of thing that arrived in the first days after a death. The questions you had not thought to ask while there was still time. Franklin opened his notepad. "The will can be challenged," he said. "The objective evaluation standard is legally problematic. Darnell Whitfield has no defined qualifications, no professional standing, and no accountability structure. A competent estate attorney could have this set aside within 60 days. Gerald is a competent estate attorney," Patricia said. "He drafted it. Gerald drafted it on Dad's instructions." "That doesn't mean it's bulletproof, Franklin," she said. "I'm being practical." "You're being quick," she said. "We've been here 40 minutes. Franklin looked at her and then at Rowan, who had not said anything. "What do you think?" he said, the tone he used with Rowan. The tone of someone asking a question they do not expect to be surprised by. Rowan looked at his coffee cup. "The farm needs attention regardless of what we decide about the legal question," he said. "The fall cover crop needs to go in before the ground freezes. The cattle need their November supplementation. The work doesn't wait for us to figure out the inheritance situation." "The work," Franklin said. 2 words. They carried something in them that was not quite mockery, but it lived in that register. "The work," Rowan said. Without inflection, they agreed to attempt compliance with the will's terms for 90 days, while Franklin consulted colleagues in estate law about enforceability. This was not a consensus. It was a ceasefire. Everyone understood the difference. Franklin drove back to Huntsville that night. He had a development project in early stages and a team that needed direction. He would come back Friday evenings and work the weekends. That was the most his professional schedule could accommodate, and he considered it a reasonable interpretation of the terms. Patricia stayed. She had arranged 2 weeks of remote work, told her team she was handling a family matter, and sat at the kitchen table the next morning, with her laptop open, before Rowan came back from the barn. When she found the note he had left on the counter, explaining what he was doing and where she could find him if she wanted to come out, she looked at it for a moment. Then she poured her coffee, put on Lester's old barn coat from the hook by the back door, and drove out to the field. Rowan was running the cover crop seeder on the north section. He stopped when he saw her truck. He climbed down and explained what he was doing and why, and offered to show her how to calibrate the seeder if she wanted to run a section. She looked at the equipment, the expression of someone recalibrating the scale. She said she'd like that. He showed her. She ran 2 passes, made 1 calibration error, caught it herself, corrected it. By the end of the morning, she was doing it competently. This was not how Rowan had expected the morning to go. Franklin arrived the first Friday with a rolling bag, a legal pad, and the energy of a man who has spent the week building a case. He had spoken to 2 colleagues in estates law, both of whom confirmed the standard was challengeable, and both of whom noted that while challenges in Alabama courts were slow and expensive, and often unsuccessful when the testator had been thorough. He had also spoken to a farm broker in Athens, who had given him a preliminary market valuation, and mentioned, without being asked, that the land was in unusually good condition for its age and history. Rowan heard this secondhand, through Patricia, who had heard it directly because Franklin told her in the kitchen while Rowan was finishing the evening barn work. The sequence of how information traveled in this family, Franklin to Patricia, Patricia to Rowan, Rowan receiving it last and often framed, was not new. It had existed for as long as Rowan could remember. He had stopped expecting it to change, but it arrived some evenings with a weariness attached to it that had nowhere useful to go. Franklin's approach to the farm that first month was organized and recognizable. He assessed, he planned, he documented. He walked the sections with genuine attention. Franklin did nothing carelessly, and by the end of December, he had produced a 30-page farm management plan. Printed and bound, presented it at the kitchen table with the confidence of someone who has done the analytical work. The plan was impressive in its structure. Crop rotation projections with 5-year financial modeling, equipment replacement timelines, market analysis. A section on what Franklin called operational optimization that included several things Lester had specifically chosen not to do, for reasons the plan did not address, because Franklin did not know the reasons. He had not asked. The person who knew them was dead, and Franklin had not thought to ask while he was alive. Rowan read the plan that evening. He made notes in the margins. Specific, numerous, not hostile. Several of them contained information that materially changed the conclusions they were annotating. The next morning he showed the annotated copy to Patricia. She read it with the focused attention of a woman trained to find the gap between what a plan says and what the conditions actually support. "Does Franklin know about the drainage issue on the East 40?" she asked. "It's not in the plan," Rowan said. "Why didn't you tell him?" "He presented it as finished," Rowan said. Then, after a pause, "That's on me. I should have said something." Patricia looked at the annotated page. When someone presents a completed analysis, the people with field knowledge stop contributing, she said slowly. Because contributing means criticizing, and nobody wants to be the one who says the finished thing isn't finished. She set the document down. That's how my logistics teams ship the wrong cargo to the wrong port. That's how farms make the wrong decisions, Rowan said. She looked at him, the look she gave things that required updating. I'll talk to Franklin, she said. I can talk to Franklin. I know you can, she said. I'm offering because it might land differently coming from me. A pause. That's also something I recognize from work. The conversation she had with Franklin that evening was not easy. But Patricia had not expected ease and had not gone looking for it. She told him about the drainage tile system. On the East 40, a chronic problem Lester had managed through a specific field operation sequence that existed nowhere in writing, and that the plan's rotation recommendations would inadvertently worsen. She told him about the grain dryer's idiosyncrasy, a specific startup procedure required or it tripped the safety shutoff, and how the plan had flagged it for replacement when in fact it was mechanically sound, and the issue was operational knowledge, not equipment failure. Franklin listened, the expression of a man receiving corrections to work he considered complete. When she finished, he said, "Why didn't Rowan tell me this when I was building the plan?" "You'd have to ask him," Patricia said. But the short version is that the plan arrived as a document rather than a conversation. It's harder to contribute to a document than to a conversation. Franklin was quiet. "I would have listened," he said. "I know you would have," she said. "The listening had to be invited first." After that, slowly and with the friction of someone changing a habit rather than adopting one, Franklin began asking before presenting. He asked Rowan about the East 40's drainage. He listened to an explanation that took 40 minutes. The drainage tile system from 1994. The specific sequence of operations that managed the slow outlet, the narrow window in late winter, when the whole system needed clearing. He tried the grain dryer's startup procedure himself, found the idiosyncrasy was real, learned that knowing it was the difference between a dryer that worked and one that didn't. These were not dramatic moments, but they accumulated, and what they accumulated into was different from what Franklin had arrived with. December brought the thing Rowan had been half expecting. The farm broker Franklin had spoken to in November reached out again with an offer, an agricultural investment firm, unsolicited in name but not in spirit. Franklin brought it to a Saturday morning kitchen table, meeting with the manner of a man who has thought carefully about how to present something difficult. He laid out the offer, the numbers, the timeline, said he was not advocating for it, said he was presenting it because they all had a right to know it existed. Patricia asked how the firm had known to make an offer. Franklin was quiet for a moment. "I may have communicated to the broker that the property was potentially available," he said. The kitchen went quiet, the specific quiet of a room where several people are deciding at the same time how to respond to the same sentence. Rowan said, "You communicated that to the broker before you communicated it to us." "I was exploring options." "Exploring options with a broker is a different action than exploring options with your siblings," Patricia said. "One has consequences, the other doesn't." "I wanted to know what we were dealing with before I raised it," Franklin said. "What we're dealing with," Rowan said, and he kept his voice level because raising it would have been easier and less honest, "is a farm that's been in this family for 3 generations and that has a standing offer from an investment firm because you told a broker it might be available. That's what we're dealing with." Franklin had the expression of a man who has made a defensible decision that is not landing as defensible. "I should have told you first," he said. "I was wrong not to." "Yes," Patricia said. "Yes," Rowan said. They did not discuss the offer that morning. What they discussed was the winter wheat that needed attention on the south field and the fence post on the north boundary that was failing and needed replacing before spring. The immediate things, Rowan had found over 9 years that the immediate things had a way of clarifying what mattered and what could wait. Franklin did not pursue the offer. He did not announce this. He simply stopped mentioning it, and the stopping was its own kind of statement. At the family's Thanksgiving dinner, Franklin's wife, Dana, Patricia, all of them around the farmhouse table with the November light coming through the windows. Dana asked Rowan over the turkey what his plan was once the year was up and the farm was sold. She said it with the certainty of someone who had already processed the outcome and was asking about the logistics of what came after. Rowan said he hadn't decided. Dana said helpfully that a man with his kind of practical experience would do well in farm equipment sales or agricultural supply. Good money in those fields, his background would translate. Rowan thanked her for the suggestion and excused himself to check the cattle. They needed checking regardless of whether it was Thanksgiving. He stood at the fence of the south pasture in the November cold and looked at the cattle and thought about the word translate. His background would translate. The verb implied that what he knew was in one language and the world Dana inhabited was in another, and that moving from one to the other required conversion, and that the original language was not the one that counted. He had been hearing this verb, or its equivalents, for most of his adult life. His high school teachers, who had encouraged him toward college in the tone of people who believed not going was a failure of ambition rather than a different kind of choice. The people at family gatherings over the years who had asked what he was doing with himself heard that he was farming and nodded with the polite nod of people, surprised to find themselves approving of less than they expected, and most consistently in the texture of his relationship with Franklin, not in any single sentence but in the accumulated assumption that Franklin's life represented the direction of success, and Rowan's represented the failure to move in that direction. Rowan was 34 years old. He had a high school diploma and 9 years on this specific farm, and the kind of knowledge that does not come from any institution. He was not naive about the gap between that and what his siblings carried. Franklin had an engineering degree, an MBA, a development company with 12 employees. Patricia had an economics degree and 20 years of managing large systems. Rowan had the farm. What the farm had given him in return was harder to quantify and easier to dismiss. He had made his peace with the dismissal, mostly. The way you make peace with things that are accurate without being fair. He went back inside and ate the rest of dinner and said the appropriate things, and the meal ended. The next morning he was up before 5. January was cold in the way North Alabama Januaries are cold, persistent rather than spectacular. It revealed things the moderate months had not. Patricia had come expecting 2 weeks and had extended to a month, then through January, then into February. She told her deputy director the remote configuration was working adequately. She did not say she was staying because she had found something unexpected in the daily farm work, something she could not name precisely, but that had to do with the gap between managing systems from a distance and being in the system. The physical fact of being in cold air with animals you are responsible for and ground you are making decisions about. She had spent 20 years making good decisions about systems she understood analytically. She had not fully understood, until January in Limestone County, how different that was from understanding something with your body after you have been doing it in a specific place long enough. Darnell Whitfield came to the farm for the first time in January, unannounced. He appeared at the fence line on a Tuesday morning when Franklin was there for a long weekend, walked over in the unhurried way of a man with nowhere more important to be, and spent an hour in conversation that moved between small things and large things without announcing the transition. Darnell was 72 years old. He was black, the grandson of a sharecropper who had farmed this county on land he did not own under conditions that were the definition of structural injustice, and who had passed to his son and to Darnell a knowledge of how to farm this specific ground with a precision that was not available in any extension publication. Because the people who accumulated it had been farming here for generations without access to the institutions that would have recognized what they knew. Darnell's knowledge of limestone county soil was, by any honest measure, the deepest available. The county's white farming families had been benefiting from his advice for 20 years, without always acknowledging where the advice came from. Lester Aldridge had been one of the exceptions. That was part of why Lester had trusted him with this. Franklin met Darnell that morning and introduced himself with the formal courtesy of a man being careful rather than natural. Shook his hand, asked questions about the Northfields wheat stand, and received an answer that was accurate but revealed, to Darnell's ear, how much Franklin still did not know he didn't know. Darnell asked Rowan the same question later that afternoon. Received an answer that included the wheat stand and the soil moisture reading from that morning, and the note Lester had made in 2019 about the Northfield's tendency to run wet in January when precipitation was above average, which it was this year, and what that meant for the spring emergence timing. Then Darnell asked a follow-up about the drainage tile outlet at the field's northeast corner, and received an answer that included the outlet and the flow log Rowan had kept through winter, which Lester had asked him to start keeping 6 years ago, which was now a 6-year record. Darnell made no visible reaction. He was a man who kept his assessments internal until he was ready to express them. That was a quality he shared with Lester. It had been part of what made their 40-year friendship work. February arrived, and the bottom ground looked the way bottom ground looks in Alabama February, dormant and waiting and quietly holding everything it knew about the season to come. Rowan and Patricia were at the fence line one morning looking at it, and Patricia asked why Lester had never put in a center pivot irrigation system. The investment would have been recoverable inside 10 years, she said, based on yield improvement data from comparable operations in the county. It was a good question, formed from real study and real data, and it missed one thing. The bottom ground's relationship to the water table in wet years, Rowan said. 3 out of 10 seasons this ground floods. Infrastructure sitting in floodwater spends its life being repaired instead of irrigated. He paused. Dad ran this calculation in his head in 1989 after talking to 3 neighbors who had made the investment and spent the decade regretting it. Patricia was quiet. How do you know about the neighbors? He told me, Rowan said. He talked while we worked. That's mostly how I learned what I know, not from studying it. From him talking while we were doing it. He didn't do that with us, she said. Not like that. I know. Why not? Rowan thought about how to say it. I think he didn't talk about the farm with you because he thought you were going somewhere else, and he didn't want it to feel like an obligation, he said. Then I stayed, and it was different. Patricia looked at the dormant ground. He was protecting us, she said, from feeling like we had to stay. I think so, and you stayed anyway. I stayed because I wanted to, Rowan said, not because I had to. She was quiet for a long time. The February sky was gray and unhurried above them. That's the thing none of us understood, she said. We thought you were here because you couldn't leave. Because you didn't have somewhere better to go. Most people thought that, Rowan said. Did it bother you? He thought about it honestly. For a long time it did, he said. Then it stopped bothering me because I stopped needing them to understand it. The work made sense to me, whether they understood it or not. He looked at the ground. It still bothers me sometimes. It's just not the main thing anymore. Patricia looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the field. "I'm sorry," she said, "for being one of the people who assumed." Rowan nodded once. He didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't entirely fine, and they both knew it. But the acknowledgement was real, and he received it as what it was. March came, and the farm came alive, the way farms come alive in Alabama spring, and the three of them settled into a working rhythm that had not existed in November. Franklin drove up Thursday evenings now, instead of Friday, adding half a day. Patricia had stopped framing her presence as remote work management, and started framing it as being somewhere she needed to be. Rowan noticed both shifts without commenting on them. The spring planting decisions were made differently than the fall ones had been. Franklin still brought his legal pad, but now he arrived with questions written on it rather than conclusions. He asked about the rotation timing on the north section and listened to Rowan's answer about the soil temperature reading. He had been tracking since March 1st and what the reading needed to reach before the corn went in. He asked about the equipment calibration for the planter and learned the adjustment that Lester had dialed in over 15 years of working the same ground, an adjustment that was not in any manufacturer manual and that produced a seed placement that the county extension recommendation would have missed. It was in March that Patricia said something that Rowan had not expected. They were in the equipment shed, Patricia helping him prep the corn planter for the season. And she said, without looking up from the row unit she was cleaning, "I've been thinking about what you said, about Dad talking while you worked." She paused. "I've been trying to do that with you. Ask while we're doing things instead of asking in the kitchen. I learn differently when my hands are busy." Rowan looked at her. "It's working," he said. "You're asking better questions than you were in November. Because the questions come from doing the thing rather than studying the thing," she said. "That's not how I've operated my whole career. I study first and do second." "Some things you can't study first," Rowan said. "Some things the study only makes sense after you've done them." She nodded slowly. She had the expression she got when she was filing information somewhere it would matter. April brought the planting and the particular pressure of a spring that was simultaneously too wet and not wet enough. The top inch dry and the 3 inches below it still heavy from March rains, the narrow window of soil condition that experienced farmers know to move fast on, and inexperienced ones either miss or rush. Rowan had been watching the south section's bottom ground for 2 weeks, checking it every morning, with his hands in the soil, waiting for the condition that Lester had called the good window. On a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of April, he told Franklin and Patricia that today was the day for the bottom corn. Franklin had a call at 10. He said he could reschedule. Rowan said do it. Franklin restled. All 3 of them were in the field by 7:30. The planting went well. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, Franklin running the tractor for the first time on a real operation rather than a practice pass. Rowan walking the field, checking the seed placement and the soil closing behind the row units, Patricia on the headlands managing the seed tender. It was hot by 2 o'clock, and the work was the kind of hot physical labor that clarifies things. You stop thinking about what you know and start thinking about what the field in front of you needs right now. Franklin discovered this somewhere around the 3rd pass, and afterwards said he understood something he had not understood before, which was why Rowan never answered his phone between 5 in the morning and noon during planting season. They finished at 5:30. Patricia made sandwiches. They sat on the tailgate of Rowan's truck at the field edge and ate them without talking much, the way people eat after hard work. And the planted field lay in front of them in the late afternoon light, the rows straight and close, and it was a good thing to have done, and all three of them felt it in the same way. At the same time, which was one of the things that physical work done together can produce that no other kind of work quite manages. Then June came, and everything went wrong at once. It started with rain, too much of it, too fast. 11 inches in 9 days in the second week of June, which was not unprecedented in Limestone County, but was unusual enough that most people's drainage management plans had not been built for it. The creek that ran through the farm's east boundary came up 3 feet in 2 days. The bottom ground flooded. Not unusually, that happened in wet years and was part of what the farm's rotation planned for. But the drainage tile system on the East 40, the one that Rowan had explained to Franklin in January, had a blockage. Debris from the February work backed up at the outlet, and the water had no way out, and the East 40's corn was underwater with more rain in the forecast. Rowan found the blockage on a Tuesday morning at 6, standing knee-deep in the ditch with the water still rising, trying to clear it with a spade and not making progress fast enough. He called Franklin. Franklin was in Athens for the day, a pre-planned meeting he could leave. He called Patricia. She was at the house. By 8 in the morning, all three of them were in the ditch. This was not a situation with an elegant solution. The blockage was partly debris and partly a section of tile that had shifted in the saturated soil. And clearing it meant working in cold-moving water with hand tools and doing it correctly rather than quickly, because doing it incorrectly would damage the tile and make the permanent problem worse, even if it solved the immediate one. Franklin had never worked in drainage tile before. He understood the system now well enough to follow instruction, but not well enough to lead. He followed Rowan's instruction. He worked without asking unnecessary questions. He worked for 4 hours in water that was cold and moving and that soaked everything, and he did not complain about any of it. By noon, the blockage was cleared and the water was moving. Not all at once. Drainage tile doesn't work all at once, but moving. By evening, the East 40's corn was no longer underwater. By the following morning, you could see the rows again. There would be yield loss. Some of the plants had been stressed past the point of full recovery, but the field had not been lost. They were sitting on the porch that evening, all three of them dirty and tired, in the particular way of people who have done something physical and necessary and completed it. And Franklin said, "If I hadn't known what you explained in January, I would have tried to clear that blockage too fast and broken the tile." "You would have," Rowan said, not unkindly, just accurately. "How long would it have taken to fix a broken tile?" "Rest of the season," Rowan said. "Maybe longer." Franklin looked at the east field in the evening light. "The yield loss we have now," he said. "Yes, that's the difference between knowing the system and knowing it correctly." "That's it," Rowan said. Patricia said. "Darnell would say, it's the difference between knowing the answer and knowing why the answer is right." They both looked at her. "He said something like that to me in May," she said. "When I asked him about the rotation timing, he said most people learn the right answer and stop. The ones who understand the farm learn why the answer is right, because next year the question will be slightly different." Rowan looked at the field. "That's exactly what he'd say," he said. Darnell had come for his second visit in May, again unannounced, appearing one morning while Patricia was checking the fence line on the west section, and Franklin was running the field cultivator on the north 40. He had walked with each of them separately for a time, asking the questions he asked, listening in the way he listened, and Rowan had noticed that his questions for Patricia were more specific than they had been in January. He was measuring something that had changed. Whether the change was enough was a different question, and not one his face answered. July was the month that showed who had stayed and who was still visiting. Franklin's schedule pressure had been building since June, a development deal in early phases that needed him in Huntsville more than the will's terms strictly allowed. He was managing it, 4 days on the farm, stretched across the week in configurations that technically complied, but the managing was visible. He arrived Thursday evenings with the energy of someone who had already done a full week of work. He left Monday mornings with the energy of someone returning to the work that felt more natural. The farm work got done, but there was a quality to how it got done that was different from March and April, when Franklin had been fully present rather than dividing himself. Rowan noticed. He didn't say anything. The noticing was its own kind of record. Patricia had no such division. She was there, fully there. She had made her peace, sometime in May or June, with the fact that this year was what it was and she was going to be in it. Her deputy director was managing the Southeast regional operations with a competence Patricia had always known he had, but had not previously fully trusted. She was learning to trust it. And in the space created by that trust, she was learning something else, which was how to be in a place rather than managing a place. And the difference between those two postures was one she had spent 20 years being good at the second one and not quite understanding there was a first one. She asked Rowan one evening in July, sitting on the back steps after the barn work was done, what it felt like to know something that other people couldn't see. He thought about it for a while before answering. "You stop trying to show it to them," he said, after a while. "You just do the work and let the work be what it is. It either shows or it doesn't. Does it bother you that it usually doesn't show?" "It used to," he said. "Now it's just how things are." He paused. "The land sees it. That's enough." Patricia looked at the south pasture in the evening light. "Dad said something like that once," she said. "I was probably 16. He said he didn't farm for anybody's opinion of how it looked. He farmed for what the ground thought of it." She paused. "I thought it was just a thing farmers said." "It's not just a thing farmers say," Rowan said. "I know that now," she said. August brought a dry stretch that followed the wet June the way Alabama summers do, one extreme answering the other. And the corn on the bottom ground that had survived the flooding came into tasseling under conditions that would have been more difficult if the drainage tile had not been cleared correctly in June. Rowan walked the bottom ground on an August morning and looked at the corn and thought about the 11 inches of rain in the ditch and Franklin in the water for 4 hours. And he thought about what knowledge cost to acquire and what it was worth after you had paid that cost. Darnell came for his third visit in August. He spent the full day. He walked all 3 sections with each sibling at different times. And the questions he asked were different from January and different from May, calibrated to what he had observed across 8 months. He spent an hour with Franklin on the North 40, asking about the equipment decisions Franklin had made and why, and received answers that reflected genuine learning. Not the learning of a man who had studied the subject, but the learning of a man who had worked the subject and been corrected by it. He spent an hour with Patricia on the east section, asking about the drainage system specifically, and received an answer that was complete and specific, and that included the events of June in a way that showed she understood what had happened and why, and what it meant for next year's management decisions. He spent 2 hours with Rowan on the south section, walking it the way Rowan and Lester had walked it, slowly, without a fixed route, toward whatever wanted looking at. Darnell asked about the soil amendment program on the clay sections and what Rowan had changed this year and why. He asked about the cattle's summer supplementation and what the change from last year's protocol was based on. He asked about the bottom ground as tasseling, what Rowan had expected after the June flooding, and what he had actually gotten, and how he accounted for the gap between them. To each question, Rowan gave the answer that was true, which was sometimes a complete answer, and sometimes an acknowledgement that he had tried something that had not worked, understood why, and adjusted, which is a different thing from having an answer, and is in some ways more informative. At the end of the day, Darnell sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, all three siblings around him. He said he wanted to tell them what he had seen before he told them his decision. He said Franklin had arrived in November with a framework and had spent the year learning that the framework needed the farm more than the farm needed the framework. He said that was harder than it looked. He said Patricia had arrived with the assumption that management competence transferred directly and had spent the year learning that some of it did, and some of it needed to be rebuilt from the ground, and that the rebuilding had been done honestly and completely. He said both of them had done something worth doing, which was to stay with something unfamiliar and uncomfortable and keep working without knowing how it was going to turn out. Then he said Rowan's name. Rowan looked at him. Lester told me once that the thing that worried him about leaving this farm was not the land, Darnell said. The land will do what it does. What worried him was the knowledge, the 40 years of specific understanding of how this ground works, which lives in your head now the way it used to live in his. He paused. He said there were maybe a handful of people in Limestone County who understood this land the way he did. He thought you were becoming one of them. Another pause. I've watched you for 8 months. I think he was right. The porch was quiet. The particular quiet of something expected arriving and mattering more than anticipated. Franklin said, I'm not going to say I'm not disappointed. He said it directly. It cost him something and he paid it. I worked hard this year and the work was real. He looked at Rowan. I also believe what Darnell said. I believe it because I watched you work and I understand now what I didn't in November. What you have here isn't the same thing I have in Huntsville. It doesn't translate the same way. He paused. I was wrong to assume it did. Rowan looked at his brother. You built something real this year, he said. I watched that too. Not the same thing, Franklin said. Not the same thing, Rowan agreed. But real, Patricia said. What Dad wanted us to understand wasn't only who should have the farm. He wanted us to understand each other. She looked at Rowan. I didn't understand what it cost you to stay. I assumed staying was the default. The thing you did when you weren't going somewhere. I didn't understand it as a choice. Most people didn't, Rowan said. I do now, she said. The deed was signed in December. Gerald Marsh's office on Jefferson Street. Same smell of old carpet and coffee as the November reading that had started everything. The farm conveyed to Rowan Lewis Aldridge, in its entirety. When Gerald closed the folder, Franklin said he wanted to establish an arrangement for ongoing financial contribution to the farm's operating capital. As a non-management silent partner. Not because he had earned a stake, he understood he hadn't, but because the farm deserved resources and he had them. And he wanted the connection to continue in a form that was honest about what it was. Rowan said he'd think about it and come back with a structure. Patricia said she wanted to continue the conversation that had started at the bottom grounds fence line in February, the one about what the farm needed and what she had learned and what she still didn't know. She said she understood her limits now, limits that were not failures of intelligence but of presence, of not having been somewhere long enough to understand it at the level it needed to be understood. She wanted to keep being present, in a form appropriate to what she actually knew. Rowan said that was the best thing either of them had offered. They drove back to the farm in the December dark, the same road, the pecans and cedars bare now, their structure visible against the winter sky. the shape Lester had intended when he planted them 40 years ago, visible now, in the way that long-horizon decisions become visible when the time has elapsed. Rowan went to the barn when he got home. The evening barn work was the evening barn work regardless of what the day had held. He moved through the familiar sequence in the familiar order. The cattle were where they were supposed to be. The equipment was in the condition it was in. The barn smelled of what working barns smell of when they have been maintained rather than neglected. He stood at the barn door when the work was done, looked at the farm in the December dark, the fields resting under cover, the pastures, the pond in the south corner catching the house light and returning it as a dark shape on darker water. He thought about Lester standing at the edge of a field the way he had stood, not looking at anything in particular and looking at everything. Rowan understood now what the standing was. It was not looking, it was listening. Lester had been listening to the land, attending to the conversation that a farmer and a piece of ground have when both of them are paying attention. And the attention was the work, and the work was the attention. The two were not separable. The farm did not belong to him. He understood that now the way Lester had written it, and Darnell had confirmed, and the year had demonstrated. You do not belong to the farm the way you belong to something you own. You belong to it the way you belong to something that has made you what you are, that has worked on you as long as you have worked on it, that holds the knowledge of who you have been and is part of the question of who you will become. The obligation runs in both directions, and the obligation is not a burden if you understand it correctly. Understanding it correctly is the work. The work never finishes. He turned off the barn light and walked back to the house through the December cold. Behind him, the farm settled into its nighttime self. The pecans and cedars stood along the road in the dark, patient, the way things are patient when they were planted for the future and have arrived in it.